friends, I'm back here on these conversations at what we've been calling cutting edge of science and spirituality. And that's the best title I could come up with. But actually, the more I think about it, both science and spirituality are exposing our ignorance about reality. But that's another conversation altogether. I'm inspired to have this conversation today with John Horgan, who I've gotten to know. And even before I knew him personally, I've been following his writings forever. And he's had conversations with the most eminent scientists and cosmologists and you name it, physicists, on some of the very fundamental questions we're going to talk about today. So I've followed his work for a long time. And I think as far as science journalism is concerned, he's probably one of the best, if not the best in the world. I read a lot of science journalism, and I find that John is always questioning more than most of the journalists that I read. Even in science, they recycle current models. And John questions a lot of these current models, which is what I love about him. So today, and he has very interesting books. We've done a review of one of his books called Mind Body Problems, and there's another book. And we'll have a link to these books and how you can get them. I highly recommend them. But I'd like to, first of all, thank you, John, for joining me in this conversation. Welcome.
My pleasure, and thanks for that introduction. I'm very flattered. I appreciate it.
So this particular conversation, I got the idea the other day when I was traveling through the airport, and I picked up this issue, Scientific American, Secrets of the Mind, the Science of Consciousness, and How Our Brain Constructs Reality. So, I was at the airport waiting for a flight, and this was there in one of the, not bookstores, the stands. And I picked it up because I felt a little bit annoyed at the subtitle, The Science of Consciousness. Because, consciousness is where science occurs. There's no science of consciousness, in my opinion, because consciousness is a methodology in human consciousness. And all experiments are designed in human consciousness. All observations are made in human consciousness. And all theories are conceived in human consciousness. So consciousness is a byproduct of science. It's like, I give birth to a child, and then the child wants to explain where it came from. So I had a bit of a problem with the subtitle, and then even more of a problem with the subtitle when I read How Brain Constructs Reality. A physical object constructs reality when the physical object is part of reality. So, and physical object may not actually exist as a physical object anyway. So then I went through the whole series, and I'm not flattering you, John. Yours was the only articulate article in the whole magazine. That
I didn't even know I'm in there. That surprises me.
Say that again.
I didn't even know that my article was in that issue.
Yeah, it's a beautiful article. It's Can Science Illuminate Our Inner Dark Matter? And it's the most lucid article in the entire magazine, which includes all these world experts. So tell me, you wrote the article. So what are the main features of the article? But even before that, we do that as a preparation. And normally I don't prepare, just honestly. I just was looking at the other magazines lying on our table. So the other one was called The Brain, and it says the art, magic, and science at what makes you. In other words, your brain makes you. And it's a very good thing to read, because what we call the universe and what we call the human brain are somehow entangled, and they co-evolved to give us whatever we know about the human universe, the brain, and what we see out there in the Milky Way galaxy and elsewhere. They go together. You can't have one without the other. And then, in the same, on my desktop here on my desk, there are these other, is consciousness fundamental in the universe? Another cover issue in the New Scientist. And yet another, now that we have the James Webb Telescope out there, the universe as we've never seen it before. Now, all this is known through the human mind, everything that you're talking about. So that makes your book even more relevant. Share with our audience this particular article and also your insights into mind, brain, body matters.
Okay. Let me begin by saying that I started thinking about consciousness as a science journalist in the late 80s, and it was because Francis Crick, who's one of the greatest scientists who ever lived, he was the co-discoverer of the double helix, which explains how heredity works. Crick turned his attention to consciousness. He looked out at biology and said, what have we not explained yet? Okay, consciousness is right there in the middle. The philosophers have had this problem for millennia, and they have botched it. They have just confused the issue. So let's try to figure out how we can get some traction with the problem of consciousness. Let's try to figure out, consciousness must happen in the brain. So let's try to figure out what happens in the brain when we're conscious and how different brain states correlate with different states of subjective experience. And I thought that was reasonable. I thought, okay, yeah, let's see where this goes. So it's been about 30 years now. And I got to know, I interviewed Crick a couple of times, and I also got to know his intellectual partner, Christoph Koch. He's a brilliant neuroscientist, now runs the Allen Brain Center up in Seattle. And the problem is they just never pulled it off. What's fascinating to me as a science journalist is that the goal of a scientific model theory of consciousness has receded from us. It looks further away from us now than it did 30 years ago. Normally, if you're making progress in a scientific field, you feel like you're getting closer, you're learning some details that are bringing the problem into focus. The field of consciousness studies is wide open now. It's crazy. It's like the Wild West of science, and everything goes. You've got Buddhism being taken seriously, psychedelics, which are now on the verge of being legalized, are also bringing in this whole new realm of altered state, strange experiences that we have to get our heads around. And as you know, there are some scientists who are challenging the whole premise of materialism, that basically reality consists of matter that produces these effects, one of which is consciousness. And there are some philosophers and scientists who are challenging that, including Christoph Koch, who was allied with Francis Crick and promoting this ultra materialist view of consciousness. So Christoph is behind a theory called integrated information theory, which has as an implication the idea that all of matter is conscious. Anything that has any kind of interaction in it, that passes information back and forth, has a little tiny bit of consciousness. A proton consists of 3 interacting quarks. So a single proton has a little spark of consciousness in it. I bring this up just to show that the field is wide open. I think anything goes. What I've concluded is that I think consciousness is an unsolvable problem. I think it's unsolvable philosophically. I think it's unsolvable scientifically. That doesn't mean I think we should stop trying to solve it. That would be impossible. That's just not in our nature. We're going to try to figure it out forever. But my guess, and this is what I wrote about in my book, Mind Body Problems, my guess is that we're going to have theory after theory forever. That's why the title is Mind Body Problems with an S, because I think that the mind, the human condition, this existence that we're both in right here, poses all sorts of problems, all sorts of mysteries, and the potential solutions to that, I think, are infinite in number. And the solutions can be very practical, like how about a solution for schizophrenia, for mental illness, as well as the really abstract philosophical questions, like what's the relationship between matter and mind. All right, just quickly going back to that article you pointed out, the mind, the dark matter of the mind. I just have become, the older I've gotten, the more I've gone into some of these mysteries, the more I'm completely mystified and befuddled, the more I've begun to challenge any kind of understanding that I have. So, I think it'd be reasonable to assume if I know any mind, at least I know my own mind, right? But I've become more and more aware that my own mind is almost like this alien intelligence within me that is constantly throwing out thoughts and emotions at me. And then it's my job to try to make sense of them. So I'm getting these feelings coming up now, and I'm trying to articulate them. Forget you, I'm trying to articulate them to myself. I'm trying to understand my own thoughts. And whenever we try to understand anything, we engage in some kind of reductionism. We try to use words and concepts in ways that make sense to us, but we're always leaving something important out. And when it comes to our own minds and all the stuff that's happening in us all the time, when we're sleeping, when we're dreaming, and right now, when we're awake, our attempts at understanding always fall short. So that's what I was trying to express in that piece. One final thought, you started talking about how you feel like I'm, you look at my journalism and I seem to be asking all these questions. This isn't by choice. This is how I am. I've always been like this since I was a kid. And one of the reasons I was attracted to science journalism is because I was so mystified by the world. I thought, well, the scientists surely know what's going on. I'll study science and then the world will make more sense to me. And instead, the opposite has happened. The more I study all these concepts, the more I've just become totally befuddled by everything, including my own self.
Okay, so John, I would like to respond to your comments so far, but I'm also realizing that this conversation could be a series, actually. But your comments thus far, let me share my response to them. I'll give you a little background. I'm an internist. I trained in internal medicine. Then I specialized in neuroscience and neuroendocrinology. My mentor was a person called Seymour Reichland. He's now 97 years old. And when I was training with him in the 70s, He was the president of the Endocrine Society, which is the most prestigious society in the world. He's 97 and he has retired. He lives in Arizona. But once a year, he comes to New York for a sabbatical, and he teaches at NYU at the age of 97. And if today he catches a snake in his garden, he'll dissect it looking for neuropeptides. And last time I had lunch with him, actually breakfast a few months ago at Balthazar, which you might know, the restaurant. He was giving me a hard time talking about the hard problem of consciousness because he's obviously still a materialist and I'm not. But, he's my mentor, and I literally have deep gratitude for him introducing me to the mind-body problem in the 70s. Mm-hmm. Now, I go back a little further, and that is a story that I like to share with you because I think it's relevant. When I was about 6 or 7 years of age, and my little brother, whom you've communicated with now on the coffee thing, who was the dean of education at Harvard Medical School, he was about 4 and I was 6.5. We were living with our grandparents in Mumbai and 2 bachelor uncles because my parents were in England. And my father was a very well-known cardiologist later in life. He described high-altitude heart disease when the Chinese and Indians were at war. He was doing cardiac catheters 22,000 feet above sea level. So they were in England, my parents, and one day we got a telegram that my father had passed all his exams and he was now a member of the Royal College of Physicians in England, which was a big deal in post-colonial India. So my grandfather, who was a First World War Army sergeant, he went to the rooftop of our apartment building, fired some rifle shots into the air, and he took the 2 little kids, Deepak and his brother, to a movie. I still remember the name of the movie, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. And then he took us to a carnival. And then he took us to a nice fancy restaurant in Mumbai. And then the middle of the night, he died. So my memory is I heard the wailing of my grandmother's mourning in the middle of the night. And me and my little brother being carried by the servant to a neighbor's house so that we wouldn't be exposed to all the crying that was going on. The next day, they took him to cremation, and they brought him back in a jar about this big, a bunch of ashes. And one of my uncles, the bachelor uncle, both were bachelors, he said, "What's a human being?" One day he's celebrating life with his grandkids, going to Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. And then the next day is a bunch of ashes. And I felt a shudder, literally, listening to that, 6.5 years old. My brother started to lose his skin. And they took him to every doctor in the world. Nobody could diagnose him till one so-called healer, non-mainstream doctor said, he's feeling vulnerable. That's why he's shedding his skin. And he's missing his parents. When they come back, he'll be fine. And so it happened. So in hindsight, 6.5, 7 years of age, I not only had an existential crisis, but in hindsight, mind, body, feeling vulnerable, shedding the skin. Then I forgot all about it. I went to medical school and, all of that and training and meeting Seymour Reichland. And then, what really happened with me was I got very seriously into meditation myself. And I have an offer for you at the end of this conversation. But in any case, I used to go to conferences and meetings on consciousness and this and that. And one day I was in a boat in Russia at St. Petersburg, and we were looking all at the beautiful art in the museum there. And right next to me was Watson, And so I said, Dr. Watson, so all this painting is because of the double helix. And he looked at me almost, annoyed. He said, where else would it be? And he walked off. Okay. He walked off. So that was my first encounter with Dr. Watson. And I had a recent one actually in New York with him after all the controversies he had with the Nobel Prize and his sexist statements and all that. Yeah. But then what happened is I became friendly with Christoph Koch in some of my conversations. And yeah, Christoph was a hardcore scientist. And, I met him many times. And I met David also, David Chalmers. And, I was talking about there being no such thing as matter, that matter is a human construct in human consciousness for interpretation of human perceptual experiences. And David was also annoyed with me, and he kicked the desk. We were sitting at a desk. He kicked the desk and he says, I refute you thus. The famous old thing. I said, you haven't refuted me thus. The desk is an experience in consciousness. Your hand is an experience in consciousness. And the pain and the sound is an experience in consciousness. And he walked off, very annoyed. Okay. Then I finally met Don Hoffman, whom I think you know.
Yeah.
And so Don was given the same challenge by our friend Crick. And my problem with Crick, with all Nobel laureates, is once they get a Nobel laureate, they become a Nobel Prize winner in one thing, they think they know everything else. So you become an expert in DNA, now you are an expert, or maybe you want to be an expert in consciousness. So he gave these two guys, Don Hoffman and Christoph, an assignment, figure out how the brain produces experience. And, Don Hoffman, after 20 years, he said, he quotes somebody, he says, thinking that the brain produces consciousness is like Aladdin's lamp. You rub the lamp and the genie wakes up and you see the world and you have thoughts and all of this. And so he said, he gave up, basically, Don Hoffman. He wrote this book, The Case Against Reality. I've done about 25 conversations with him. We have reached like millions of people now. And that's my history with them, Don Hoffman, Christoph Koch, Watson, just as an aside. But here's the big issue that I have with everyone, including you. Mm-hmm. And that is, you say, the problem is unsolvable, but that doesn't mean we'll give up.
Right.
And so who's the we that is not giving up? What is the we that is looking for an answer to the hard problem? Because, when we say we want to solve the hard problem of consciousness, obviously there's an entity called we, and there's an entity called I. I want to do this, right? And normally, when I'm asked the general public, where are you? They say, in some of my seminars, they say, since you use the word I, where are you right now? And they all raise their hand. I'm here. I say, where's Deepak? And they say, you're there. And I say, that means there's a little you looking out of the brain. And there's a little Deepak looking out of the brain here too. Problem is, no one has found this entity in the body. While we're talking about out-of-body experiences, we can't explain in-body experiences. That's the real mystery. Forget about the out-of-body experience. There's no I to be found. And if you go to the Eastern wisdom traditions, which are totally ignored, by the way, last time, David Chalmers gave a talk on the heart problem. I said, David, and he was quoting all kinds of philosophers, from the beginning of time to today, all the major philosophers. Incidentally, when they had their Halloween party at NYU couple of years ago, they all came dressed as a philosopher, which was very funny. I went like this, but they all came dressed as philosophers. So David went on and on about philosophy. I said, David, how much Eastern philosophy have you read? Have you read even some of the Western philosophers who talk about, the physical world not being real? Wittgenstein, our life is a dream, we are asleep, but once in a while we wake up enough to know that we are dreaming. Any experience that goes by, evanescent, transient, ephemeral, this conversation, by the time you hear my words, they don't exist actually. Any time you perceive something, it's in the past. Doesn't matter if it's 100 million light years away or it's a microsecond away, but every experience in the past. And so every experience filtered through a human construct, a human story, scientific, mythical, religious, and given a label, suddenly becomes a physical world. Atoms, molecules, force fields, they are experiences in consciousness before we give them names. Okay. And I was reading your article, and what was very fascinating to me, because we love models, we all like to create models. Did you say that again? That's my Siri. That's my Siri that went on right now. So sorry, I didn't understand the question. So what you say here in the end, because we all like models, which I found totally, absolutely wonderful, is you say that, let me find the article. You say, and you just said it a little earlier as well. He says, what hope do we have of capturing the thought passing through your head right now? A thought unlike any that you, let alone anyone else, have ever had or will have. And you also talk about the fact that they're unpredictable. You don't know where they come from and where they go. And so, if you read quantum field theory right now, not that that's the solution either, that's another model. But, you say, what is the quantum field? It is the field that spews out, apparently, what are called virtual particles as understood by the uncertainty principle. So first of all, virtual particles, not real, because before you can measure them, before you look at even whatever, Higgs boson, whatever, by the time you look at it, it doesn't exist. So it is, it is something that shows up and disappears. That's why and by the uncertainty principle, it's just like a thought, actually. A quantum particle, an energetic, momentary, evanescent measurement in human consciousness, is just like a thought. You don't know when it will show up, and you don't know when it will disappear. And yet, if these virtual particles are the basis of the whole universe, then they have constructed everything from the human brain to this conversation, and your whole things about free will and all these dilemmas. And then, I'm reading this article here again, which is very interesting. Time, the arrow of time. All quantum theories, are bidirectional. There's no arrow of time.
Here's what I found.
Okay.
You found an answer. So anyway, your response.
Okay. I'm not sure if I have told you before, but for the last 2 years, I've been steeped in quantum mechanics. I've written about quantum mechanics a lot throughout my career, but I just decided as a pandemic project 2 years ago to try to learn it the way physicists learn it. I've learned linear algebra, which consists of vectors and matrices. I went back and relearned calculus because the Schrodinger's equation is a differential equation expressed in calculus. So I'm trying to learn the language of quantum mechanics. What is a wave function? a wave function is this weird mathematical object that gives us the probability that a particle will be in this place or that place. And so quantum mechanics has embedded within it all these things that we're talking about. It has embedded within it the mind-body problem, the relationship of matter and mind. Why is it that the wave function describes these probabilities, but then we look at the particle and there it is, in a position that was just predicted by the wave function? Does that mean the particle actually didn't exist in some sense? It was indeterminate before we looked at it? Okay, so I'm reading all these interpretations of quantum mechanics by physicists and philosophers, and I know the language a little bit better now, so I feel a little more qualified to judge. And I've just decided that nobody really knows what they're talking about. And everybody is, I think, grabbing onto interpretations or philosophies for aesthetic reasons, because a philosophy makes them feel good, because they're committed to the idea of objective material reality, or because they like the idea that consciousness plays a really important role in existence. I've decided that, and I go back and forth, realism, anti-realism. I'm fascinated by these questions. I've taken a lot of psychedelics, which makes me inclined to believe, it makes me sympathetic to anti-realist philosophies like Donald Hoffman's and yours. When I'm tripping, I feel like I'm part of a gigantic field of consciousness. I'm connected to everything. The problem I have with anti-realist philosophies, and there are lots of them out there, and they go back millennia, and they're part of Hindu metaphysics and Buddhist metaphysics. The problem I have with some of them, it's the same problem I have with the simulation hypothesis, this crazy idea that we're living in some kind of computer program created by an alien hacker living in his basement. David Chalmers takes us seriously. I don't like philosophies that undercut our moral responsibility in the world. I don't like philosophies that diminish human suffering. So the big question, there's a book that came out recently about quantum mechanics, very good, popular book, not technical, but still it was very good. It's called What is Real by a guy named Adam Becker. Good question. What is real? Is matter real? Is mind real? You're very good at bringing everything back to consciousness. What I bring everything back to is human pain, which is associated with injustice, with political issues, with economic issues. So to me, I listen to some philosophers and it's so abstract, it's so metaphysical, and I'm thinking, what is real? What's real is these homeless people outside my building. What's real is people still dying of the pandemic. And I worry that anti-realist philosophies, which actually question the idea of a material objective reality, make it harder, that they lend themselves to escapism. They make it harder for us to deal with these really serious problems. I'm obsessed with warfare, this horrible war going on in Ukraine, and the United States itself is a very warlike country. Since 9/11, we have incinerated tens of thousands of children. And we've committed horrible war crimes ourselves. That is real. So I'm trying to find a metaphysics that starts with the axiom that human suffering is real, and human suffering is often caused by this thing we would call injustice. Where is injustice in the Schrodinger's equation? Where is injustice in the matrices and vectors with which we represent particles and the physical world? You can't find these things in physics, but they're real and they're important. They matter actually more than a lot of the things that matter to philosophers and physics and physicists who create these big abstract systems that don't include the realities that most of us deal with, including you and me, that we deal with every day, like death. You just told that very moving story about the death of it was your father?
Grandfather.
Your grandfather. And I mean, if you're talking about a philosophy that makes, a scientific theory that makes sense of reality for us, that's another thing you got to start with. We are mortal creatures. How do we understand that? I would like to believe, as you seem to, maybe I'm misreading you, but the idea that everything is consciousness fundamentally, I find very consoling. I would like to believe it, but I've lost some dear friends recently, and I'm still always struck by the hard finality of death.
Okay. Now let me respond to what you just said. And I'm feeling there's a series of conversations that we need to have. But first of all, where is first of all, no, you mentioned Buddhism and Hindu philosophies and all these anti-realistic philosophies. And I was thinking of a quote from Alan Watts. He said, if religion is the opiate of the masses, then the Hindus have the dope on it. And I want to respond to your question about human suffering, because it's an important question. And I agree with you right now. We are walking our way, collectively sleepwalking our way to extinction with climate change, with injustice, with mass murders, with social, economic, gender, sexual injustice, with extinction of species, poison in our food chain. If anybody is even slightly awake, they would say that if you don't think we're going to extinction, then you're sleepwalking too. And we are collectively, insanely sleepwalking to extinction. That's for sure, unless we embark on a more peaceful, just, sustainable, compassionate way of living. Now, you mentioned human suffering, and you also mentioned death. So I wasn't kidding when I said, these days it's very fashionable to say I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, But the essential fundamentals of that experience, whatever we call it, spiritual, religious, in every religion, by the way, it doesn't matter. I've written books on comparative religion. There are three things about that religious or spiritual experience. One is you find yourself as an entity that does not exist in space-time, that is therefore beyond birth and death, period. It is not in space-time. Space-time is seen as another projection of human consciousness. Second is, as a result of that experience, which you also get when you use psychedelics sometimes, because psychedelics basically wipe out all the editing of your human constructs and your ideas of what you think is real. People under psychedelic experiences, but even as a result of that same religious experience, they have a feeling of what you described, that you're part of a vast mystery, that you're connecting with it, And as a result, you experience empathy, you feel what others feel, compassion, you have the desire to alleviate suffering, and then you do something about it. You say, and that's called love in action in these traditions. And the third component of the same spiritual experience is loss of the fear of death, because you realize that your identity that dies is not a true identity. It was a false identity to begin with. Now, if you look at the Buddhist teachings, and I'm not a Buddhist. I don't know what I am. In fact, that's the big problem. I wish I knew who or what I am. But, the Buddha's four noble truths: there is suffering. There are causes for suffering. There is a solution to suffering. And here's the path. Right. But the path is going inward rather than looking for something out there, inward to the source of all experience. And if the infinite, whatever reality is, the cosmic horizon is 47 billion light years away. It's expanding. People say, what's the universe expanding into? And it's a meaningless question because it's creating space-time as it expands. So, what happened before the Big Bang? But there was no time. Where did the Big Bang occur? Since there was no location, which location did it occur? It occurred everywhere. It occurred as a...
My apologies. I couldn't hear what you said.
Shut up, Siri. Okay, so where did the Big Bang occur? It occurred everywhere because cosmic wave radiation is coming from everywhere. Time began then. Space-time, obviously, space began then. What was there before? Meaningless question. What's the universe expanding into? Meaningless. 2 trillion galaxies, current estimates, 700 sextillion stars, uncountable trillions of planets. Actually, according to the latest estimate, there may be 60 billion habitable planets in just the Milky Way galaxy, based on what we call the Goldilocks zone. Mm-hmm. So now, amongst all this panorama of existence, we have a planet called Earth. We named it, of course. On scale, this planet is not even 1 grain of sand in all the beaches. On this planet, on this 1 grain, the other day I went to the beach, I picked up a grain. It wouldn't stay in my hand. It drifted off with the wind. On this grain of sand is a species called Homo sapiens, self-described as the wise ones, who think we can solve this mystery. Either it's the ultimate hubris or it's the ultimate confidence. So given all that and all these mysteries, maybe we should ask ourselves, are we asking the right questions based on the right assumptions? Because every philosophy, every theory begins with an assumption. Matter is real. Now let's go from there. Okay, or consciousness is real. Let's go from them. Or both are real. How do they interact? Let's go from there. So every theory starts with a question. And I haven't been able to figure out who or what is asking the question. Okay, what is this thing that asks the question? Because the awareness of the mind is not the mind. A thought comes, it goes. You described. Who is watching this thought, or what is it that watches the thought? Who comes up with the theory of general relativity? We say Einstein, but what came up with that theory? Where was the math done? What is mathematics? Why is it so unreasonably predictable, as has been said? I can't answer any of these questions.
Okay.
Finally, on the problem of suffering and so on, mm-hmm. If the infinite is infinite, and all our equations, we need infinity, right? You use infinity for all kinds. You're much more, you know math much more than I do. Infinity, it's a symbol. What does it mean, infinity? Okay, does reality have a border? Consciousness, if it had a form, I'd be able to see it, but I can't see it because it's doing the seeing. So these are so. Where's mathematics? How does Gödel's theorem fit in? And why is mathematics accurate? And who's asking these questions? Is mathematics some activity in the universe, or is it a product of human consciousness? And when it comes to suffering, if the infinite is infinite, it contains everything, including suffering, including joy. It's our problem to figure out how to evolve in the direction of joy and minimize suffering by alleviating the suffering of others. So I don't see problem with, in fact, the best way to alleviate my suffering is to alleviate other suffering.
Yes, and that is what I like most about Hinduism and Buddhism. I think in some cases they feel a little bit as though they are trying to solve the problem of heartbreak by getting you not to care so much about the world, by getting you not to love the world so much, by getting you not to fall in love with other mortal creatures who are going to die someday. In terms of, I just got to give you an idea that came to me in a trip. This is about 40 years ago, and I've written about this a little bit in a couple of my books, but I'll just lay it on you. It's my big answer that I came up with. And so I had this trip, I took this drug, it was much stronger than I expected, and I went into this trance state. And I think I had already been reading about the singularity and, the idea of the whole universe possibly becoming one giant computer. I'd read Freeman Dyson, the great physicist, had talked about this. And so in this trip, I became this giant computer at the end of time. So it's an all-powerful thinking machine. It basically, the whole universe is dedicated to thinking. And so it's essentially God, and it can imagine anything. Any reality it imagines exists. It can solve any problem. So what would this giant cosmic brain think about? It would think about where it came from. It would try to solve the riddle of its own existence. Any other problem is trivial compared to that. It's the same problem that we all deal with. You're just saying, who are you? You're trying to figure that out. We're all trying to figure that out. And God is trying to figure that out too. That was the big epiphany I had. And God, in my trip, couldn't figure it out. I say he, but I mean he, it, she, they, all of the above, could not answer the question of where he came from, and flipped out and had an identity crisis, and it caused a kind of multiple personality disorder. And so God sort of exploded and created this world with all these selves that are actually the fragments of God, God's altars. I came up with this idea, as I said, this is like 1981 when I had this trip. Since then, I found that Carl Jung talked about this, an idea very similar. Alan Watts talked about it, who you mentioned earlier. I once talked about it with Stan Grof, the psychedelic psychiatrist. I was telling him my idea, and he said, oh yeah. I mean, that's, and he told me, like, that's a thing that I described. Same with Ken Wilber. I think you've crossed tracks with Ken Wilber, the mystical philosopher. The problem, and so I thought, okay, I've solved the mystery of existence. And the reason why life is so painful and ugly as well as beautiful is because it comes out of this act of divine creation that is stressful. It's that God is having this identity crisis that's really bad and creates the world as a distraction. I still think about that idea and write about it now and then.
It's, by the way, even though you had it as an original idea, this is a very important idea that exists in many philosophies, that we are differentiated from one stem cell as different knowers, in the same way that, our fertilized egg differentiates into you and me. But before differentiation, it's the singularity, and we are all shattered pieces of the one soul. So that's not, it's actually a very brilliant insight you had yourself.
Well, it in some ways it's consoling, but here's the problem I have. And this does relate to, I have a sort of tense relationship with Buddhism. And I went on a silent retreat a few years ago that had a profound effect on me. And I try to meditate when I can. But I feel as though some of these spiritual disciplines are trying to get me not to care so much about the world. And that's probably grossly unfair. And
it's unfair because they're saying don't get melodramatically involved.
Okay.
But do get involved with compassion. Otherwise, your caring melodrama is not about the world, it's about yourself. When I say I love you, do you love me? That's not love. It's self-importance. Okay. So when I love, period. And in that there's no room. That there's an Indian, Tagore was an Indian poet who said, when I feel love, I know it as truth, and it is not a sentiment. It's the ultimate truth at the heart of creation, which is we are one being differentiated into different minds.
Okay, that I love that idea, and I feel like I should go read. I think I've seen fragments of Tagore before. The reason I love it is because I'm writing this book now about quantum mechanics, and I'm trying to solve some of these problems that we're talking about. And one of the things that's come to me is that we have these feelings sometimes. So there are some situations where I play hockey. I play hockey on ponds up north, and every now and then I'm coming back from a hockey game and I'm sort of exhausted, and I've been hanging out with my old friends, and it's a beautiful winter sky, and I'm suddenly overcome with this feeling of sort of, it's a mixture of sadness and gratitude. I'm looking at the world and it's so beautiful, it breaks my heart. The sadness comes from knowing how ephemeral it is. And, where are feelings in physics? How do, feelings are something that you have to get rid of in science and even philosophy, because they subvert the notion of truth being objective. But to me, some of these feelings that we have, that Tagore was just talking about, this feeling that I have, you could say it's love, and love is always sad because the beloved can't last. At least that's how I feel about it. And but something about that feeling, it's not just a feeling. It's not just subjective. It's cosmic and universal. It's a truth. But I'm trying to figure out how to express that. I think mystics know it and poets know it, but I'm just a science journalist. I'm trying to figure out how to put this into words.
I think sages, poets, psychotics, and geniuses all know it, but the rest of us struggle.